Despite escalating diplomatic and political tensions between the United States and China, both sides remain committed to a trade deal. We will take a look at ongoing negotiations. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. At the beginning of this year, back in January, the United States and China signed Phase 1 of a bilateral trade agreement. It signaled a truce in their bruising dispute, with the U.S. cutting tariffs on Chinese goods and China pledging to buy more American products. Last week, media reports said both sides would hold a virtual meeting to advance trade talks. The review was never officially confirmed by Beijing or Washington and eventually did not happen, reportedly because of scheduling conflicts. No new date has been set for future negotiations, leading to concerns that rising tensions between the world's two largest economies may affect the flow of commerce. To discuss where the negotiations stand and how will that impact the world's economy, let's bring in our panel. Ashton is the Senior Director for Government Affairs at the U.S. China Business Council. She joins us right here in Washington, D.C. Also in D.C. via Skype, Jeff Moon is President of China Moon Strategies, a consulting firm. Einar Tangen is a current affairs commentator joining us from Beijing. And also from the Chinese capital via Skype, Wang Cong is chief reporter for the Global Times. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Einar Tangen, let me start with you. As I said, these talks were never officially acknowledged and were supposed to review progress at the 6-month mark after that Phase 1 deal had been signed. Why do you think they were postponed?
Well, it's really not to anybody's interest right now. I don't think Donald Trump wants to admit that there's a failure. China is only 1/4 of the way in its economic buy-in that they said that they were going to do. And quite frankly, Beijing is watching the elections.
So do you think Beijing is trying to push this out until after the election?
Well, I think both sides are not anxious to bring this to a point. It's not possible that China would be able to put in enough orders after the election to make up for all of the time, for all of the money that's been promised. Keep in mind that there have been constant attacks on China's ability to do business in the U.S. Virtually no technology is available. There are military moves. There are political pressures being applied to every ally of the U.S. against China. Against this kind of background, obviously Beijing would want to discuss exactly how these are going to be impacting and whether there's some way of resolving this. China has sent consistent messages that it wants to talk, but there has been no indication from Washington that this is important.
Jeff Moon, there are analysts, both here in the United States as well as in China, who say that a postponement might not be such a bad idea. It gives both parties time, as Einar Tangen just told us. There's an election coming up in the United States. It also gives China more time to buy more products, and China's also been experiencing some serious flooding. It gives it time to recover from that flooding. What do you make of it?
Well, this agreement was all about purchases and some other low-hanging fruit in policy areas. So if we're looking for results, it's going to be in the purchase area. If the parties decided to delay this so that they can make more purchases and make more progress with regard to the agreement, then I'm all for that. I'm looking for results. There's also press coverage that at the annual leadership retreat in Beidaihe, people were preoccupied, maybe couldn't attend. I don't think any of that matters. What's really important here is that this bilateral relationship is a falling knife. And we need to grab that knife or slow it down as much as possible, and both sides need to talk. So I think it's fairly important that we at least keep the communication going and talking, even if there are ongoing differences and friction.
Anna Ashton, as Jeff reminds us, this relationship is going through a very rough time right now. And you have written that the relationship has become incredibly tense and fraught. How did we get to this point?
Well, I really think that it comes down to COVID. Unfortunately, Phase 1 in January promised to be a stabilizing force in the relationship. While it didn't deliver remotely everything that the business community would have liked to have seen, it did offer a chance for there to be a drawdown in tensions over tariffs and for there to be a way forward where there were constant check-ins between both sides, progress made on the commitments that were in the agreement, some of them significant, and then, hopefully a phase 2 negotiation that would get to the rest of the important issues that the business community faces. But when the COVID-19 outbreak spread to the United States, quickly the focus began to turn to China's perceived culpability in the pandemic, and that has only ratcheted up and up and up in the months since March.
Yeah, it seems to be, Anna, that we've had a number of things that happen here. It seems like a perfect storm. As you point out, it's COVID. We also have the election coming up, and then there have also been accusations that President Trump has bungled how the United States has handled COVID, and he's looking for a way out of that.
Well, it's definitely no secret that the Republican Party has floated the strategy internally to pivot to focusing on COVID and China's culpability when asked about COVID and the Trump administration's handling of it. And I think that we see that frequently in the way that President Trump himself responds to the outbreak. There may be merit in focusing on what China could have done better, but the fact remains that to the extent that that is politically expedient in an election year, it is doing damage to the U.S.-China bilateral relationship at the same time.
Wang Cong, of course, when we look at the relationship between the two countries, there are differences, which we see, political differences and diplomatic differences. Clearly, these differences, diplomatic and political, run very, very deep. We've seen consulates closed here in the United States, Chinese consulate closed, and then a U.S. consulate in China was closed as well. President Trump has been using very harsh, insulting language when he refers to China and the pandemic. But in spite of all that, Bloomberg news agency in the United States reports that trade is the one area where relations are, in the words of Bloomberg, sober. So does that give you hope that this will go away in time?
First of all, I want to address the reported delay in the phase one talk. I think there are a lot of talks about how China lags behind with the purchase of U.S. products. I don't think that is the issue here. The issue here, I think, is mostly I've been talking with some trade experts in Beijing. The most important issue for the Chinese side is that there's simply no good atmosphere. That's the word they use for the talks, because of what we have been talking about, the constant attacks on China from the Trump administration, whether it's trade, it's in the South China Sea, it's Hong Kong or Taiwan. It's just one action after another. So there wasn't simply a good atmosphere for any types of talk, including trade. And I think the phase one trade deal is very important for both sides because of exactly what the Bloomberg news report says, because it's the last or the stabilizing force in the China-U.S. relationship right now, because remember, the phase one talks is one of the very, very few channels of dialogue between the two countries. Still, in Beijing, I think most people would agree with that news report that trade would remain the stabilizing force, even though right now we're encountering a lot of tension. So I think trade also could run beyond the election. What we see now in China-U.S. relations, this downward spiral, is mostly, I think, because of the elections in the United States. So most people are watching to see that after the election, maybe trade and economic cooperation will return.
Einar Tangen, of course, relations between the United States and China have become one of the big issues in this election. Let's listen to what President Trump had to say.
So China's been buying a lot of things, and they're doing that to keep me happy, but they're dreaming about Joe Biden. They would love to have that happen, but I don't think that's going to happen. They are dreaming about him, and so is Iran dreaming about Joe, and so are numerous other countries. They dream about it because if that happens, they'll own the United States. And China, I can tell you specifically, will own the United States.
So, Einar, listening to rhetoric like that, do you see anything positive coming out of the fact that we have President Trump and his opponent, Joe Biden, really trying to outdo each other on who can be tougher on China?
Well, I think there's on the Democratic side, there was a very deliberate decision to be made that they were going to take this issue away from Donald Trump. They could see him telegraphing that he was going to link China and the Democratic Party, call them soft and do this. He's still doing that, even despite that. But you notice in his tone, and it's not the same Donald Trump of 4 years ago, and certainly he's still playing the victim game. But let's talk about the larger issue here. Remember, 4 years ago, Donald Trump said he was going to do a lot of things. And at this point, he's accomplished none of them. The economy's in tatters. The United States is more divided than ever. All his foreign policy initiatives have failed, whether it's Iran, whether it's North Korea, or China. So at this point, I do believe that from the U.S. perspective, they don't want to acknowledge another failure.
Jeff Moon, the United States announced more restrictions on the Chinese corporation Huawei, and of course we know that President Trump is trying to force the Chinese company TikTok to sell its U.S. operations. There has been a response from the Chinese government, from the Chinese Foreign Ministry. This is what a spokesman had to say. Let's listen to this.
This once again proves that the so-called freedom and security are nothing but an excuse for the digital gunboat diplomacy pursued by some U.S. politicians. This type of bullying is a blatant denial of the market economy and fair competition principles that the U.S. has always advocated.
So, Jeff, is this really about national security and China gathering intelligence on people, mostly teenagers actually, who use TikTok?
Well, I would actually trace the souring of relations back to May of last year, when China walked away from a comprehensive deal. And as you heard me say on this show, if China only did purchases and did not address the industrial policy differences, we would get into an age of reciprocity that would get very nasty. And here we are. The current disputes are about three things. One, as we've already talked about, is about the election and Trump's very unhelpful and childish rhetoric, which no one can defend. Then there are national security concerns here. Putting Huawei on the entity list was a serious result of Huawei's activities in Iran and other things. As for the TikTok transaction, the national security issue is the privacy rights of teen children and who's going to own their data. You know, China just passed a civil code that includes privacy provisions that will come into effect on January 1st of next year. So China has an interest in this. And the third thing that's really important here is reciprocity. China wants to talk about this situation as if it started on August the 5th when Trump banned TikTok. This began 20 years ago when Google, Facebook, and countless other American firms were shut out of or extremely limited in the Chinese market. So I think there's extremely limited sympathy for the Chinese firms that are now being restricted in the American market when there are so many restrictions that are well documented in white papers by the American and European chambers of commerce as to the great limitations that they face in the China market, despite promises otherwise.
Einar Tangen, what do you make of that? Have there been restrictions? Well, there have been restrictions on both sides, even more so in China.
Well, absolutely, but there's a very marked difference. When you're talking about Google and that period, China had passed laws and these companies were not in compliance. What you have now are just deliberate economic attacks. Personally, I believe that it should be open, but from the Chinese perspective, all they see on social media is a constant barrage of negative reinforcement on a daily basis, in essence, of vilifying China. So it's hard for them to see why they should be opening a window to the West when it seems purely an ideological driven desire to change China or even affect regime change. I mean, what Jeff has said is very clearly, he believes that China should adhere to a kind of an American exceptionalist policy where it's only liberal democratic capitalism, and that is not possible.
Go ahead, Jeff.
No, that is absolutely not what I've said. What Chinese people are hearing on social media is censored because no outside voices are allowed to come in. That's a big part of the problem. Where I was hoping Einar would go was that we need to have some kind of a reset where we try to understand what the rules of the road are going to be for things like data and free flow of communication and free flow of data. We need to get serious about this issue. This is going too far. These differences have been too great, and I think both sides perhaps need to adjust.
Anna Ashton, when we listen to some of the rhetoric coming out, especially on this relationship, I mean, it seems to have gone in all directions. There's been lots of talk about decoupling the economies. We've heard this word pretty often. I mean, you're talking about decoupling the world's two biggest economies. I mean, could that happen without there really being serious damage done to the economies of both countries?
Thanks, Anand. No, of course not. It couldn't happen without there being serious damage done. And I'd like to say that, while I absolutely agree with Jeff's point that in terms of looking at this issue through the lens of reciprocity, China certainly has not provided access to numerous American companies in the tech space that wanted to be in the China market. That's true. But let's not fool ourselves that these executive orders are in any way about furthering the interests of American companies. In fact, they're going to undermine the interests of most American companies. WeChat is not simply a social app where people connect for personal reasons. It is a payment processing app, the most popular and dominant payment processing app in China. I don't have to tell you that. And on top of that, it's a business platform. It is an essential way of paying for things all over the place. It's an essential way of getting around, and on and on and on. We have companies telling us that if they can't continue to use the WeChat platform in China the way that they have adapted it for their business purposes, it will really become an existential threat to their ability to remain in China, and that the losses that their company will suffer because of the importance of the China market to their overall global presence will be significant enough that it will result in layoffs here in the United States. And we don't have just one or two companies telling us that. We have dozens and dozens of companies telling us that. And at the same time, we have repeatedly attempted to get clarity on whether or not these orders apply simply domestically in the United States or whether they're meant to apply extraterritorially, and so also to U.S. companies and people operating in China. And we have only heard that that is still being deliberated. So there's no reassurance yet that this is simply going to affect the United States. This looks to me like it could be a shortcut to decoupling, and it's very, very worrying.
So, Anna, looking at an example of that, for instance, if Apple cannot include WeChat on its iPhone, as an app on its iPhone, by U.S. law, then its phones are not going to be very attractive in China. That could hurt its sales. How badly could it hurt its sales?
Quite badly. It's the largest cell phone market in the world. And of course, if you're a Chinese person living in China, if you're a US person living in China, why on earth would you buy a phone where you can't use the most ubiquitous app that is a part of daily life in numerous ways? You just wouldn't.
Plus, the other thing is, President Trump announces these things, he signs these executive orders, but I'm sure he must be getting telephone calls, say in the case of Apple, from Cupertino, from its headquarters to the White House to ask him, what are you doing?
I'm sure he must be, but that hasn't yet resulted in any indication that they are going to moderate the intent of this. It hasn't resulted yet in any clarification of what the intent really is. We've just heard more rhetoric from other parts of the administration that we should be prepared for more apps to be the subject of executive orders, that we should be prepared for more limitations in the way that the U.S. and China can interact in technological arenas.
Wang Cong, these issues are clearly of deep concern to the Chinese government because, they've been talking about trade with the United States, but now we hear that the United States attacks on Huawei as well as on TikTok and, as we've been saying now, WeChat. The Chinese government want those to be involved in the trade talks as well. So what is the Chinese strategy here?
So that's why we can go back to the delay of these meetings, because the Chinese side is still figuring out. Remember, when we signed this phase one deal in January, it was believed to be a ease to the tensions. However, that never happened. With the COVID-19 pandemic and also the elections hit up in the United States, there's more and more tensions, and it expanded it to diplomatic tensions and also geopolitical tensions. So then now China I think when we're talking about the purchase of U.S. products, most analysts in Beijing believe that we can reach that, because remember, these are yearly target and also within 2-year period target, and China can reach that. However, there's the belief that even if we do that, the United States will not stop its crackdown on Chinese tech companies. I want to address a little bit what Jeff said about the Google, comparing Google to the TikTok and Huawei. Google, even today, there's no law in China that banning the entrance of Google and other Facebook and other U.S. companies into the Chinese side. What Chinese government asked is a version of their services, of their platform that is in accordance to the Chinese law. And when they figured out that couldn't work, they simply withdrew. With regard to TikTok, I mean, you're issuing executive orders forcing a Chinese company to be sold to an American company. In Beijing, I think the officials call this modern piracy, robbery. That is simply not the comparison you want to make when it comes to TikTok and Google. Also, when you talk about market access, I think this is a gradual process. This is also, it appears many friends in the U.S. is hard to understand. China is still a developing country, and a lot of these sectors are opening in a gradual process. That is also what the Chinese officials are saying, that we are opening, but we're not open all at once, or as what some of these U.S. accusations or demands are going at the pace. So I think overall, with regard both in the phase 1 talk and also with regard to Huawei, from the Chinese side, I think it's all related.
Yeah.
However, they also want to compartmentalize these tensions and want to move forward, especially in trade.
Yeah, Jeff, what's your response to that? I mean, is it fair for the Chinese to say to Google, listen, you can come here, you can operate here, but you've got to comply with our statutes?
It's not just Google. The top half dozen or so American companies represent, in terms of value, more than 20% of the S&P 500. And almost all of them are completely or extremely blocked from doing business in China. Amazon can't do cloud, Google can't offer its services, Facebook can't do social networking. So this is not just about Google not accepting Chinese censorship. And the irony here of the discussion about WeChat is that China limited American or prevented American companies that offered these services a long time ago from coming into the Chinese market. And so the only way people have been able to communicate is through a censored mechanism. And now, because that is the only mechanism, that censored mechanism and data mined mechanism is the only one that we have, that suddenly we need to do all possible to preserve that. I think another alternative is to open up the Chinese market to all apps. What about WhatsApp? What about Telegram? Let all of those apps come in and compete. Let's have a real market economy. I'll say it again, let's have a reset. Let's have more discussions.
Einar Tangen,
I don't think this is the way to do it. That's what I'm saying. I don't know any regulation that banning those companies you're saying. I mean, look, GM, Ford, they operate in China, but they also follow the Chinese regulation.
Yeah.
Yes, there are criticism about how they are required to have a joint venture in China, but they did. But Google and Facebook, they were under a lot of pressure back home, that they were giving up to the Chinese pressure. So they just simply withdrew. There's no regulation.
Okay. Einar Tangen, we've got a few minutes left, and I want to move on to the bigger picture here. China released some economic data just before the weekend, which showed that Chinese output continues to increase, but there's been a small drop in retail sales. So how would you assess the Chinese economy, or its recovery, really, right now?
Well, it's doing pretty well if you kind of compare it to the rest of the world. I mean, it emerged first and it seems to be making progress, but obviously demand is going to be an issue, both internally and externally. People expect some sort of fiscal monetary stimulus to come down either through projects or through other means in order to stimulate this. But right now, it looks like China is kind of doing a wait and see and being very cautious. They don't want to load it down with debt the way they did at the last financial crisis. They see that as a warning sign. But, you know, I just want to add some data to what was said. You know, Anna was talking about the markets. U.S. companies, according to Barron's, have $700 billion worth of investment in China, $500 million in revenues. When Apple customers in China were asked what they would do if they had to make a choice between WeChat and Apple, 95% said that they would choose WeChat. Keep in mind that China is 25% of Apple's global sales.
Anna, just on that point, you know, as Einar Tangen just told us, China is adopting a wait-and-see attitude. But what is the situation in the United States right now? I mean, the U.S. is going through a recession. Unemployment is pretty high at 10%. There's been talk of another stimulus, but that's now stuck in the U.S. Congress. It's in stalemate. I mean, can the U.S. really afford this kind of tense and risky relationship with China right now?
I mean, I would certainly say no. One of the most frustrating things about the status quo that we're left with the Phase 1 deal is that we still have so many tariffs in place. You know, we have tariffs, high tariffs on 2/3 of all imports, more than that, from China into the United States, and high tariffs on many, many exports of U.S. goods into China. This isn't making the recovery easier. This isn't making it easier for companies and operations that import, you know, midstream products that they're going to do something with here in order to finish the good and sell it in the U.S. market. And now they're having to pay extra at a time when they can ill afford to pay the normal price. It's not good for workers, for consumers, for anyone. And if the Phase 1 deal starts to unravel, which, look, you know, we have Lighthizer and we have others in the administration who are still positive about the deal when they're asked, but we have a president who is pretty routinely negative about the deal. If it does start to unravel, what's going to happen? Are we going to have higher tariffs? Are we going to have that list 4 that was staved off in December, but that applies to a whole host of domestic consumer products that are critical consumer products? Are we just going to make Americans' lives more difficult?
Okay, and that's where we are going to have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.